So this is Kate McCord, and I'm sitting here with Melissa Meyers, who I knew in Afghanistan. And this is the first time I think we've connected since Afghanistan. And we've got an excuse, right?
Yeah. Yep, we do.
Because you wrote a book, and I love your book, and we get to talk about your book. But honestly, it's a bit of an excuse because I just wanted to see you and connect with you. Melissa, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful. I'm enjoying the summer and good things.
So we met in Afghanistan in 2005, I think. Is that right?
I think so. I was trying to think about that as well. And we moved there to the north in April of 2006. So we came to the country in the fall of 2005. So I think we met in the summer heat, actually.
I think we did. And I remember when we met, so this is why I thought you came after me, but I think actually you might have come around the same time, but you went to Kabul and then you showed up where we were living. And I remember, Melissa, when I met you and your family, and your son was a baby at the time. And I remember meeting you and thinking, this is such a nice couple. And, what are these Midwesterners doing in Afghanistan? So give us just a little bit of background. How did you and your family wind up there?
I think a lot of it had to do with our journey prior to coming to Afghanistan. We were actually in a Bible college, and there we were studying cross-cultural communications. And it's a bit of a long story, but actually in the year 2000, my husband spent 9 months in Peshawar, a place called Peshawar, Pakistan, teaching Afghan refugees English. And during that time, of course, he came back from that journey, and then September 11th, 2001 happened. And we were seniors in college at that time. And like everybody else who were a little bit older and processed those moments, we watched those airplanes go into the Twin Towers. And later, when the story started to unfold about what we were hearing, and stories that I think, obviously had been going on for a long time, but that we were as Westerners aware of. And then after we graduated, I had nursing school to finish, but some of the people that my husband had worked with in Peshawar, Pakistan, had moved to Kabul. And so when we were looking for a place to kind of work overseas, because that was always the goal, we went for a 10-day trip in 2004 to kind of see what kind of opportunities there would be for us. We'd already decided that we were going to go and work in Afghanistan. So it was more finding a place to connect.
I love the way the Spirit of God moves in us, right? The doors opened and people came in. We had this opportunity to talk about your book, and I love your book. I love that you wrote it, Melissa. I loved reading I need to introduce the book, Beneath the Ancient Dust, Inspirational Stories from 9 Years in Afghanistan. And here's the thing I so love about this book. Your stories are authentic. They're real. And to me, it feels like, wow, you just opened your heart and invited people to come into that place where Jesus lives. And you brought people into Afghanistan, a kind of the nexus, I think, where there is you and your family and Afghanistan and Jesus, and you shared so much of that so authentically. And I can say it's authentically because I knew you in country. I mean, I remember praying with you. I remember being encouraged by you, being in your house, and especially, right, going out visiting with Afghans, 110-degree heat, and we had to put coats on.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you for writing the book, and I want to talk a little bit about the book. But first, I want to talk about the Afghans. I remember walking through the dust with you, and I don't know how you carried your son. He was such a big boy, and you are such a small woman. And I remember trying to carry him and saying, okay, that's 10 feet. You can have him back. But here's what I want to ask you, Melissa. What are the gifts? Like you and I, we were in Afghan homes. We were sharing stories, drinking tea, sometimes getting sick, laughing a lot, sometimes crying. But what are some of the gifts that you received from the Afghans?
It's a big question because in some ways I feel like there's so many gifts, that I was given. And we were there almost 10 years. And so part of writing a book was processing, all of that all the stories I had, but all the, in a way, the treasures that I had found during my time there. I think one of the greatest gifts that I loved about the Afghan people was their sense of community and their sense of time for others. And so, here, if I want to get together with somebody, I have to pull up my planner and they pull out their planner. And then, a month in the future, we are able to schedule a time to get together for supper for an hour and a half, And in Afghanistan, life is so fluid, you can decide that day to go next door and drop over for tea. We would get knocks on our gate all the time, and the neighbor children would drop over. And, being an introvert at first, this killed me. It always killed me to just have my house so open to people and to have to be available, but after, I can't say even the first year, let's say after like 3-4 years, I began to really appreciate just the time that people have for you. And even if they're going to, busy and they're going to go off and do something, they drop what they're doing and they just make time for you. And coming back to America, you live in a neighborhood, you might not ever see your next door neighbor. You might not ever even interact with them unless, something is majorly wrong, then you might kind of see them. Or you just, you drive into your garage at night and you leave. And so I've tried to bring that back, with me and tried to open up times where I can have for people and just kind of keep that sense of community. But it's never going to be the same as it was in Afghanistan.
It really is such a different culture.
It is, yeah. And there's reasons for it, but yeah.
Yeah, there's reasons for it. But I remember that too. I remember that, not only did they always have time for me, but they expected me to always have time for them. Yes. But what did it feel like for you to know that, anytime we'd knock on someone's door, they had time?
Well, if it was me knocking on their door, it was wonderful. If it was them knocking on my door, then, it was a little bit less of a wonderful feeling if I wasn't prepared, and I just learned to do things more Afghan. And so our listeners wouldn't know this, but this about Afghanistan is that usually they keep, candies and they keep treats around to serve their guests. And so then I had to start doing that. So I didn't feel so discombobulated when somebody showed up. And
I know, I love that. They're always ready, right? The thermos is always full of tea. The little bowls of treats, they're always ready.
Yep.
Yeah, there was a sense of that community, and I love it that you really appreciated that. Do you miss that?
I did, because I feel like sometimes we are lonely here. We put up, physical and walls in some sense. When there's plenty of walls in Afghanistan, but you can knock on the door and it would be open. And here there's just sort of, being from the Midwest, we have a lot of politeness, and being polite is not, you don't want to disturb your neighbor. And, sometimes that can lead to not actually building relationships or making relationships. And so it's harder. So I do miss people knocking on my door in that aspect.
Yeah, I miss that too. I just, there was such a sense of welcome there amongst the Afghans.
Yeah.
And I wonder, Melissa, how did it change you being there? You were there for a long time with your family. I mean, other than keeping treats in the house so that people so you were ready for visitors. But yeah, in kind of deeper ways, how do you sense Afghanistan and your time there having changed you?
Well, we had kind of talked personally about this earlier, about Afghanistan being a very complex culture, and you have these beautiful things within their culture, and you have some very hard and difficult things. And then, of course, with all the conflict that happened in Afghanistan after living there almost a decade, we were not immune to that. And so we lived through some wonderful times and we lived through some very difficult times. And I think most people who have worked in Afghanistan would come home and say that being in Afghanistan gave them wounds, and not maybe physical wounds, but emotional wounds, spiritual wounds in some sense. And a lot of brokenness came out of being there. And then coming back in that brokenness and in the wounds that maybe I've gotten from my time there, intermixed with all the beauty as well, I feel like I'm a much kinder and more compassionate person. And I have a lot of tolerance for just not being quick to judge, I guess. And that's a gift to me, actually. And I don't want to quickly peg somebody and kind of put them in a box about when I start to hear their story. I want to really listen to them. And I feel like during my time there, I was given that opportunity to have my worldview expanded, and also just by the things that we lived through, coming back and just being able to care about people more on a deeper level than I probably ever would have before.
Yeah. Growing in compassion and being able to care about people more. How does that relate to expanding worldview?
I think just in like my current job, I work as a NICU nurse. And so I deal with people from all walks of life. I like to say anybody can have a baby, and you just never know where those people are at, and you don't want to, some people can handle stress very well. Some people really need you to go in there and meet them in that time of need. And these are people from all different countries sometimes. These are people from all different walks of life, economic statuses, and just to try to understand their story and not maybe judge them from what I would have growing up, from just kind of my Midwestern viewpoint. So.
Yeah, I love that line of meeting people in their stress. And I'm thinking back to Afghanistan, and I'm thinking there was a lot of stress that our beautiful Afghan neighbors were dealing with, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. Yeah.
And what was it like for you, maybe in the beginning, when you were first understanding the language enough to understand their stories? What was it like to you to have Afghans inviting you into their stress?
Sometimes I was always surprised at how open they were and willing to share, and just because I would think sometimes they would be more reserved, but I found a lot of the women, in a private setting, in their homes when they'd invite you for tea, would just really open their hearts. And it took me a while to kind of understand why they were doing that. I think sometimes being an outside person, they didn't feel like you were going to judge them because we weren't in their family network, and we know how strong those relationships can be sometimes. And hearing their stories, of course they had read things about in the news or read books and everything, but then meeting face to face with some of these women and seeing them, their stories became quite real and tangible. And sometimes there was a lot of despair. I didn't know there was nothing I could do about their situation. Sometimes there was hope in the fact that we could pray about this and hope for God to intervene and work. And he did on a lot of occasions, but just there's a lot of poverty there, and it can be overwhelming at times. You want to fix it, and you can't.
And there's something about that, isn't there?
There is, yeah.
Entering someone's sorrow, entering their despair, right? Their hopelessness, and being willing to hold their stories. I wonder, you were there, you were listening, people were sharing their stories with you. What do you think it was like for the Afghans to be able to share their stories with this? And I know the podcasters can't hear it, can't see you right now on the screen, but blue-eyed, fair-skinned, blonde-haired American woman. What do you think it was like for them to be able to kind of lift their stories out of their own hearts and lay them on the floor before you?
Well, it's my hope that it was a blessing to them. I think anytime we can share what's burdening our hearts to another person, that does actually lift the burden, even when things don't change. Sometimes I look back, and especially in those early days when I couldn't speak the language very well and I couldn't understand, and people were so gracious and kind, the cultural mistakes that I made. I think, sometimes they laughed at me, but it's good. It brought them laughter for the day.
Free entertainment.
Yep. And there were things that they were very proud about their own culture, and it was nice for them, I think, to share with an outsider as well. Foods, things that they can make, and some of the gifts that Afghan women have with their distozi, their embroidery skills, and everything. I think that they were proud to share with, and I really hope that I eased their burden, or it just was there to kind of be a listener and to enter into those moments, those sacred moments that were friendship moments, as well as just two people meeting from that never really should have met, and the time and place. So I have to believe that God was there and God was in those moments.
You mentioned praying for people. What was that like?
There was, because I'm a nurse, I had an opportunity a lot to take care of people's minor ailments, I guess. Sometimes they were major, but there was a lady who was a cleaning lady at one of the agencies that we worked for, and she got bit by a dog, really nasty dog bite on her arm. And so every day she was coming to me, and I would clean, well, in the beginning every day, and I would clean this wound, which was quite deep actually, and she couldn't use the arm for a while. And then because, even though it's a different faith that they have, they're very used to prayer, and prayer is a part of their daily life. And so when you ask someone, can I pray for you? To us, it might seem kind of a step, because we don't often do that in society in America, but for them, it was actually a pretty natural thing. And then just to be respectful and try to bring them into the prayer as well, have them. So I would try to encourage this lady to pray too. And then finally her wound healed, and, she could go back to work, which is encouraging too.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You mentioned despair and looking for hope, and we hear these stories, and then you talk about praying with them and Jesus being with you in people's houses. I'm not sure how to word this, but I'm thinking about, there's you, there's Jesus, there's this story that you've heard, yet another heartbreaking story. And how did you come to terms, or how did you bring those stories to Jesus, or find peace in Jesus, or find something in Jesus in those stories?
I mean, it depended on the situation, and sometimes I would look and see how I could meet that. The natural thing, of course, is that if we can be the hands and feet of Jesus, then we could try to do something. And then a lot of times I couldn't do anything. And so sometimes it was just in my own prayers, bringing those stories before Jesus and laying them at his feet and releasing them, and releasing the situation into God's hands, and praying and hoping that he would carry those. And it was releasing a lot of burdens, because we can't, like we talked about, the amount of pain and suffering, in a country like Afghanistan, God is there to carry it, not me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that sounds like an active kind of releasing.
Yes. Yep. Actually bringing the story to God in prayer, and, letting it go physically. Physically, praying that we lay it down at his feet.
Yeah, because they're too heavy, aren't they?
They are, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't think we could have been there for so long if I would have tried to solve everyone's problems.
I don't think you could have lasted 3 weeks if you tried.
I know.
You're stronger than me, so perhaps you could.
Maybe a month, yeah.
And I remember being with you, and this is part of the reason I so wanted to do this interview today. One of my fond memories is walking down the street to your house. I don't know if you remember, but your dog was the brother of my dog.
Yes.
Except my dog was nicer. My dog was nicer.
I know. He was.
But I remember for a while, for months, I remember walking down the street to your house and praying with you. Yeah. I remember praying together.
Yeah, I do. Early mornings, yeah.
Early mornings praying together in your house. And I wonder if you would just speak, you've mentioned prayer, if you would speak a little bit to the place of prayer and, yeah, for you while you were there in country.
Yeah. Being a mother, I didn't always have time, to have scheduled times away for prayer. And so I would try to find times, or sometimes it was in the midst of doing things. And even cooking a meal, we can pray all the time, can't we?
Yeah.
Pray without something. And so I feel like my prayer life did grow a lot, throughout my time there. And, and sometimes it was a time to get away and get recharged. Sometimes it was those desperate prayers, just quick, help me in this situation, and try to listen, try to be quiet, spend some time trying to receive from God as well as just bringing needs before him. And so, yeah, as I think about it now, I haven't, I guess, thought about that question too much in depth, but I can see a thread, of prayer that ran through our whole time there. And there was a time in 2010 that was a particularly difficult time, and we were home. And I went away for a actual prayer retreat during that time. I spent 3 days, 2 nights and 3 days in a prayer cabin that was set up for this kind of thing, a silent retreat. And there I just really needed to know if we were supposed to, at that time, to go back to Afghanistan. Actually, I was struggling with a lot of things, and just spent 3 days reading scripture, being quiet, trying to listen to God, actively praying. And there I really felt like God gave me the strength to kind of finish out our time in Afghanistan. And I knew that, after that, those 3 days, I knew it wasn't time to leave. That's probably the most vivid memory I have of actually really trying to get refocused, for after a difficult time there.
Yeah, so the place of focus is looking into the face of God, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's kind of paradoxical. You want a question, you want an answer about Afghanistan. What's my future here?
Yeah.
Or any other of a myriad of questions. And the answer is found not kind of doing the pros and cons and looking at the situation and mathematically mapping it out, but looking into the face of God.
Yeah.
I love that. Listening. Do you think there are ways that your capacity to listen to God deepened through your experience?
Yeah. I mean, even before Afghanistan, in my own faith, I always had a deep sense that God always wanted me to be honest with him. And of course we know that, right? We know that, but we like to be kind of spiritual, and we like to, bring things and not necessarily, we have ways to spiritualize things by our words, and, but actually, when we're angry, let God know you're angry about something. And when something is really difficult, or, you're just not happy with it, it's okay to let him know you feel that way. And I think we do damage as Christians when we don't let ourselves go through these different emotions and let God know that this is how we're feeling. And as well as the good times and the bad, we need to praise him when things go well and celebrate those moments too of joy. But that definitely deepened at a lot more opportunities in Afghanistan to be honest with God about difficulties. And
so this is your Midwesternism coming through. It definitely provided opportunities. 110-degree heat and all kinds of other crazy things. I love that line, we like to be spiritual. I don't think I could have survived being in country if I didn't get real with God.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Okay, I'm angry today, I'm sad today, I'm frustrated today, I'm delighted today. More opportunities. One of the things I noticed when you were talking was you said, you were a new mom.
Yeah.
You had a very young child. And I know from talking so I've never been a mom. And I know from talking to friends who've had the first baby, their 45-minute, hour-long quiet time every day gets like thrown out the window. And there's
the baby doesn't follow the schedule.
The baby doesn't follow the schedule. And I find myself these days, now that I've learned a little bit, talking to young moms about, where can you find Jesus and how can you pray and, that kind of thing. And I just realized you did that. You made that transition while you were in Afghanistan.
Yeah. So about the time that we had been in country a year, my husband and I looked back and we just said, whoa, what have we been through? We just felt like that year was so hard. And, we didn't know at that time, was it being new parents? Was it totally changing our lives and moving to a completely different country, learning a different language and culture? And then in the course of a year, moving twice, because we moved first to Kabul and then we moved, north. And we just felt like we had been hit by a truck, and I think looking back in hindsight, because I deal with it now, a lot of people who have new babies, and I just think it's good when we're young, we think we can do everything. Because had I known how difficult it would have been at that time, I think I would have advised myself to wait a little bit. But we survived.
Me laughing with you. When we're young, we think we could do everything. But then you did it.
We did it, and we survived. And, it wasn't our undoing,
Melissa, you're talking about that first year. And I have to say that I thought when I met you and your family, I thought, man, these folks really have it together. and I do remember praying with you about some of the decisions you were making as a mom. And about whether or not to work, and the lovely woman who was taking care of your little guy, and how dear and sweet that was, and going out visiting. Like, I remember that you were making a lot of decisions, but I really thought, and maybe this is your sort of Midwestern kind of even keel, everything's all right. How did you, so before we talked about kind of put Jesus beside the stories of the Afghans and you, let's do the same thing. Jesus and you and your husband and your child. And how did all that come together for you in that, especially in that first year?
I really felt like I was called to go to Afghanistan. And so I sort of, in my mind, assumed I should be doing something, while I was there.
You mean other than just being there?
Other than just being there and being stuck in the house with, a baby. And but also, of course, was called to be a mother and called to be a wife, because that was all part of the package, But I really felt like I didn't want to have a passive role in my time there, and kind of having those deep feelings and trying to figure out, are these just mine, or is God working through this? Am I going to be missing out on something that God has for me to do if I don't respond to this? And that the number one was to learn Dari so I could communicate, which had its own challenges with having a small baby. And though even in the 9 years that we were there, I of course never felt 100%, fluent or 100%. Bilingual, the place we all want to get.
And never arrive.
I needed to be able to converse with my neighbors. I needed to be able to meet them, in their needs. And so the easy part was having language tutors come into our home. The hard part was just making sure that what I was learning, I was practicing. So getting out there. And so some of the visits that, I went with you out in the community was also just to get myself out of the house so that I could be using this language that I was trying to work on. And so I felt like I got a good foundation in the language, and that was really important for me as a mother, so that I could continue to do the work that I felt like God wanted me to do. And later on, I was able to work at a hospital and work in a community development program. And, there's other things that I did, which God opened doors for. And it was always a challenge, though, to balance stuff at home. But I was happier, and the house was, everybody in the house was happier if mom was happier, right?
How did you know? There was one decision in particular you made when you went back to work at the hospital a couple days a week.
Yeah.
And if I remember right, there were some other people in the foreign community who thought you probably shouldn't do that. And it required a little bit of confidence on your part. You had to know that that's what God was calling you to do.
Yeah.
How did you know?
Sometimes when God speaks to us, he puts a deep kind of peace in our hearts. And for that particular decision, I just knew that I was supposed to be doing that. And I had that peace. And I felt like if I wasn't doing it, that I would be missing out on something that God wanted me to do. And I think it's just that peace that doesn't go away. Sometimes we have little ideas in our heads that nag at us, and sometimes we should listen to those ideas. Sometimes they're just our own ideas, but sometimes I think it's actually how God speaks to us. And thankfully, part of moving into another culture, you start to learn more about yourself. And you can go the other way and not, you can get kind of caught up in everything that's changing around you. But I really felt like God started to kind of show things to me about my own personality and what I needed to do to thrive. Because it's easy just to go into survival mode there, especially really easy with a lot of things that you do with. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to kind of find a place where I was thriving and to get back to that even, when times when you went back into survival mode, but just to always have that as the goal.
And knowing when you've drifted back into survival mode, right?
Yeah. Yep.
This was one of the things I so appreciated about you and your husband. And it's this consistent kind of walking out into the world, walking back, looking at Jesus, praying, listening, walking back out into the world, returning to Jesus, and it almost like breathing, like not like I don't want anyone who's listening to think that I have you up on a kind of pedestal and you mastered sinless perfection, because I was there. Because I did know you.
Yeah.
It was more like I've often said that one of my favorite quotes, and I'm not even sure if it's a quote, but it's not mine. It's some old monk was asked, "What's a saint?" and the monk said, "A saint is a Christian who gets up, falls down, gets up, falls down." And I really admired that about you. I admired and appreciated and was encouraged by Melissa, this constant reorienting to Christ that I experienced in you, that I saw in you, and that I heard in the book. And I think that's part of what I mean by so authentic. I never felt like you were giving me platitudes. I never felt like, and there were times, by the way, I don't know if you remember it, but even in your very polite Midwestern way, that you gently corrected, admonished, warned me. For those who don't know both of us, we are the opposite personalities, right? You're the introvert, I'm the extrovert.
Right.
You look for the even keel. I will fly. We're really, really different. And I appreciated that about us too, but I loved that constant reorienting to Jesus. And when I read the book, I heard that. I saw Jesus, and I saw the same Jesus in you in the book that I saw when we would sit in homes and you would open a story, or you would have words of real encouragement or blessing or prayer for someone in front of us, or even just the way you looked at people, this compassion. And then I read this book and I heard your voice, and I saw you, and I saw Jesus in you. And I just want to give a little introduction into this book. It's called Beneath the Ancient Dust, Inspirational Stories from 9 Years in Afghanistan. When I read this title, the first thing I thought of was the verse from Paul when he says, "You yourselves are our letters written on our hearts, that they're read and that they're heard and read by everyone." And this is what came to mind, that what you did in this book is that you invite us to read Christ in your heart and in your experiences. And I love that. I love that. And I wonder what brought for you this idea to write this book.
Yeah. That was a God thing too, actually. When I turned 35, sometimes we do New Year's resolutions, and the new year was coming up, and I had written a lot of emails to people describing times in Afghanistan, over the years, but it really felt like God wanted me to start writing, actually, and not necessarily a book. I didn't have that in mind in the beginning, but just shorter stories. And then it sort of grew and evolved, and I had some of my stories published in a global network for women. And then out of that, I realized that because we had been there for so long, that I had a lot of stories that I was processing.
Yes,
and
you did.
They would be in my head, and just by writing them down, I was able to interact and step back and see how God was working in it too. And it became quite a meaningful exercise for me. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the challenge was to make it cohesive, make it actually something that you could read start to finish and would make sense. And so the book evolved, I would say.
I love that even in the writing of it, you were seeing God more clearly, perhaps, in your...
Yeah, especially in the stories that I brought up in the book. And then, in the beginning, I didn't actually plan on bringing stories from my childhood into it, and stories but then it, as I was writing it, things would start to come to mind, and it kind of spurred deeper thoughts and memories, and then I realized that actually this was all connected. And yeah,
it is connected, isn't it? I mean, we arrive in country, and it's not like we begin there.
No, we don't.
Come with
and even the cultural things that we observe, we bring it from our own lenses, from our Western lenses. And then, for me particularly, it was being a Christian and having a good foundation in reading the Bible and the stories and stuff, and then entering into this culture that just is so different than our Western culture. And there's a lot of modern things in Afghanistan, and there's a lot of very ancient things and traditions that have been done for years and years, and things that we don't encounter. And it made me think of the Bible stories in so much of a richer and fuller way. And that's what I wanted to bring in the book, and I hope I did in some aspects of it.
Yeah, and I saw that in the book as well. So what are you hoping that the readers, someone comes and reads your book, what are you hoping for them?
I'm hoping that as they read these stories and interact, they have a deeper appreciation for a country that often is viewed in a certain way in the media, and that we haven't learned a lot about the beautiful aspects of the culture, But I'm also hoping that people are able to identify with some of my stories and some of the stories that have happened in the book, and connect it to their own lives and their own spiritual walk, and how God has worked in their own lives. So even though I wrote very personal stories, I feel like some of them people can connect with in their own lives, that maybe there's similar experiences they have had. And I'm really hoping that they see how God has been whispering and working in their lives as they read it.
Yeah, I felt that when I read the book.
Yeah.
And it was interesting for me, because we do have very different backgrounds too. And I think what happens when we encounter Jesus within another, the Jesus within us speaks.
Yeah.
And there's something that happens in our own hearts as well. And I think that's part of what happened for me when I read your book. So this is the book. It's Beneath the Ancient Dust by Melissa Meyers. On Amazon, you're Melissa R. Meyers.
Yes.
And honestly, I love this book. It's a sweet book. It's a tender book. It's full of truth with the capital T, the one who is truth. And I recommend it to you. And so where can you find it? You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on some other places. You can find Melissa on Goodreads. On my website, you can find a link to Melissa's book, and you can reach Melissa at so here's an email address: Beneath the Ancient Dust, all one word, @gmail.com. I really hope you get a chance to download or order the paper copy and read this, because this is just such a beautiful, tender story. And Melissa, thank you for giving me the opportunity to read your story, and such a gift it was to me. And for giving me the excuse to do this interview, because it is such, like, I'm going to be walking on clouds for hours, for days, because I got to see you here. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So great to connect with you too.
You've been listening to Kate McCord speaking with Melissa Meyers, author of Beneath the Ancient Dust, Inspirational Stories from 9 Years in Afghanistan.